Hello, my name is Kevin Hind, and this presentation is entitled The Economic Impact of Price Ceilings. In this particular presentation, we're going to examine the case of a maximum price for rented accommodation. Let us begin by examining equilibrium in the rented accommodation market. In that particular market, the demand curve is given by the blue line, D, and the supply of rented accommodation is given by the pink line, S. The equilibrium in the market is at point A, where demand equates with supply. And at that point, the rental price is OP, and the quantity of rented accommodation, both demanded and supplied, is OQ. As we know, there are benefits from the operation of a market. In this particular diagram, the demand curve shows the willingness to pay for rented accommodation, shows all those prices that people are willing to pay to buy some form of rented property. And the supply curve shows the marginal cost of actually providing one more unit of rented accommodation. If we look at the demand side, if we look to those consumers who are willing to buy up to OQ, then their total willingness to pay is the area BAQ0, but their actual payments that they make in terms of the total rent that they pay out is OPAQ. So there is a surplus for consumers equal to ABP. In a similar way, we can think about producer surplus, because there are clearly a rental income for landlords. They get OPAQ as rental income, but the total variable costs of providing that rented accommodation up to OQ is 0AQ, so that there is a benefit, a producer surplus to landlords of AP0. So the market works well for consumers and landlords in this instance. And let's look at an instance when we interfere with the market and impose a maximum price, a price ceiling, that is a price below the equilibrium level, in order, for example, that people may be able to afford rented accommodation. So the government or the local authority would impose a price below OP, which would be effectively a rent control, a control on the level of rent that can be charged. And this diagram actually shows what would happen if we had a rent control. Here we've restricted the price to P max. That's a price ceiling of P max. You can see that the equilibrium price is, or it should be, OP, and the equilibrium quantity would be OQ if the market was not being interfered with. But here, the local authority is imposing a rent control of OP max. And at that particular rent, OP max, the quantity supplied is OQ1 and the quantity demanded is OQ2. So we have a shortage in the market with this particular lower price. Notice that landlords have no incentive in supplying more rented accommodation at OQ1 when the price is OP max, that is when the rent control is imposed. For example, they won't supply OQ3 rented accommodation because in doing so, the marginal cost of supplying the rented accommodation is much greater than the price that they receive. That is, point X, which is on the supply curve, representing the marginal cost of supplying OQ3, is greater than the price that they receive, the rent control P max, represented by point Y. So there is no incentive for landlords to supply more when the rent control is imposed. So when we get a maximum price, a rent control, there is a change in the economic welfare to both producers and consumers. Let's have a look first of all at what happens to producer surplus. You may remember it was 0PA when we didn't have any interference in the market. But now with the rent control, the producer surplus is 0P max C. So it's considerably smaller than it once was. So what's happened to the rest of the producer surplus that existed when we didn't have this interference in the marketplace? Well, consumers have got a surplus still. Those who can actually buy this particular product, rented accommodation, they can buy OQ1, and clearly there's some willing to pay a price up to F on the demand line. So clearly they have made an enormous benefit of FC per unit. But of course there are other consumers who are willing to pay more as well than they actually have to pay. So clearly consumers are benefiting from the imposition of this rent control, this P-max, of P-max. And that particular area is BFC P-max. Those who can get this particular product, the rented accommodation, will gain PGC P-max at the expense of producers. So some of the producer surplus has gone to consumers. The net loss, therefore, to the producers from this rent control is GCA. And there are, of course, losers from the point of view of consumers, because consumers would buy Q1, Q0 more if the market was working perfectly. So there are consumers, some consumer surplus loss that's equivalent to FGA. And that's the overall loss, really, that both consumers and producers lose out. The deadweight loss or overall loss is equal to FAC because of this rent control. Clearly, if we change the elasticity of demand or elasticity of supply, as we will do in a moment, then we get some different implications. Here we're showing what happens to the implications for a rent control if demand is more inelastic. And of course, with rented accommodation, there might be parts of the country where the demand for rented accommodation is very inelastic. You can certainly imagine in capital cities around the world that the demand for rented accommodation is price inelastic, because there are few substitutes for it. The real substitute is actually to move out of the area. So within a particular area, the demand is very inelastic. So what happens then when we get this inelastic demand, and we put that on as the demand line DI, and we've left on the old demand curve D. What happens is that we get less of a shortage when we impose the rent control, the maximum price or price ceiling. The shortage is Q1, Q3. The producer surplus hasn't changed. It's still 0 P max C. But there is an additional consumer surplus loss equal to FHA. So overall, the consumer surplus loss is now much greater than it was when we had a more elastic demand curve. It's HGA as opposed to FGA. So that's an important consideration when trying to think about the welfare implications of a rent control or a maximum price. Okay, what about a maximum price when we've got inelastic supply rather than inelastic demand? Well, when we've got inelastic supply, as we're showing here in this diagram, that would be representative of a line like SI, a steeper supply curve. SI is much steeper than S. It indicates, for example, that landlords can't really change the amount of rented accommodation, even though rents may go up. So it's a lot steeper. In other words, it's suggesting there's some degree of some constraint on landlords in respect of price rises. They've only got so much that they can actually put out to the market at any one moment in time. So what happens then? Well, let's just compare the two supply curves. If you look at the supply curve S, the more elastic supply curve, there we had, when we had a maximum price, the shortage was Q1, Q2. But with a more inelastic supply, then the shortage has now shrunk to Q4, Q2. So there's still a shortage, but it's a lot less. The producer surplus is also larger than would be the case when we had supply curve S. Remember, when we had supply curve S and the maximum price, the rent control, then the producer surplus was P max C0. But now the producer surplus with this more inelastic supply is actually bigger. It's P max J K0. What about consumer surplus? Well, again, because of the inelastic supply, this allows for a greater consumer surplus. And what we get here is consumer surplus of B M J P max. The deadweight loss is actually a lot less than would be the case under having a supply curve S and the demand curve D with this particular rent control of P max. So the deadweight loss is now MAJ. I suppose the final point then is to actually try and understand what would happen to the supply of rented accommodation over the long term if returns were not at the equilibrium level. And in order to do that, we're just going to look at the elastic supply curve. There are other possibilities, but we'll let you have a think about those for yourself.
The biggest impact is going to be on the quality of rented accommodation. And to see this, it's necessary to put yourself in the place of landlords who are now facing a rent control of P max. With the rent control, there is a shortage. Demand is Q2 and supply is only Q1. Now, what the landlords will try and do in order to meet the shortage is they'll need to shift their supply curve from S to S1. What in effect they're doing is they're reducing the quality of the accommodation available, the rented accommodation available. And what they're in effect doing is spending less on repairs and maintenance and the general upkeep of rented accommodation. In other words, the quality is going to fall. And we can show that as a reduction in the marginal cost in supplying rented accommodation, so that the supply curve is effectively shifting to the right. But what that means is that, for example, at a quantity supplied of Q2, the marginal cost of supplying rented accommodation was actually at a point like Y. But now it's a point like Z. It's the marginal cost of supplying Q2 has fallen from Y to Z. And it does this throughout the new supply curve S1. Unfortunately, that's not the end of the matter, because with a fall in the quality of rented accommodation being made available by landlords, this will have an impact on the demand curve. Remember that the old demand curve, the line BD, was associated with a particular level of quality. But now, if the rented accommodation on offer is going to be of a lower quality, this may well lower demand. And we've tried to show that by putting the demand curve back to D1. And in effect, what's happening is that there is now a lower value placed on the rented accommodation. So, for example, in demanding a quantity like Q1, originally consumers were going to be willing to pay a price like X, but now they're only willing to pay a price like W because the quality of the accommodation has fallen. So we're getting both effects on the supply side and on the demand side. Consumers are reacting to the poorer quality accommodation on offer from landlords. The rent control then has reduced the quality of rented accommodation available. In our diagram, the new equilibrium level is at point V. The equilibrium price has settled to the rent control price, P max, and the quantity is 0 Q3. In our particular case, the intersection of demand and supply, the new demand and supply, D1 and S1, actually show a lower quantity being demanded and supplied. That is, Q3 is actually lower than Q0, the actual quantity demanded and supplied before the rent control. But the impact on the quantity really depends
on the extent of the shifts in demand and supply resulting from the quality changes and the perceptions that consumers have, and how much they will lower their demand by, and how much indeed landlords will lower their marginal cost by. We could have ended up at a point like A prime, where the new demand and supply intersected. That would have meant that the quantity on offer and being consumed would have been Q0. That would have been the same quantity demanded and supplied as was the case before the rent control. But remember, the quality of the rented accommodation has now fallen because of the rent control. So what we see from a rent control is although the justification for rent control is it's to allow people on lower incomes to get lower rents, get more affordable rents, it does have economic consequences which we must take into account. Thanks very much for listening.